Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel. Today we're going to analyze the 2005 psychological thriller Flight Plan. The movie starts in Berlin with Kyle Pratt, an aviation engineer mourning the sudden and unexpected death of her husband. She's trying to keep a brave face for the sake of her daughter Julia, but the cracks start to appear as we see Pratt visit the morgue, intercut between old memories with her husband David. On the eve of their flight back to New York, Pratt senses something's not quite right, like someone is watching the house. She goes to the window only to see a shadowy figure in the neighboring home. Ignoring this feeling, she tells her daughter everything's fine and she should get back to sleep. The next day, they're seen leaving the house, but Julia mentions that she's afraid to go out, so Pratt offers to hide her in a coat. They get into a taxi headed for the airport. Once there, Pratt mentions that they're flying aboard a brand new plane that she helped design the engines for. They both board the plane first, and when seated, they see the coffin being loaded onto the aircraft. Julia steams up the window with her breath and draws a little heart with her finger, clearly missing her father. Both Julia and Pratt decide to rest in the back seats as they're empty, so they can stretch out. However, when Pratt wakes up, Julia is nowhere to be found. She checks with the other passengers, and none of them have seen Julia. A flight attendant suggests Julia might be playing somewhere on the plane with children her age. Kyle walks around in a panic. She commands the flight attendants to check the plane, and Kyle, having designed the aircraft, suggests places to look. When Kyle rechecks their seats, Julia's teddy bear is found where she slept. At this time, the flight attendant, Stephanie, checks and sees no record of her child Julia ever boarding the flight. The check-in flight attendant also doesn't remember seeing a child. Kyle is confused. She tries to prove them wrong by showing Julia's boarding pass. However, Kyle can't find it, and Julia's luggage is also missing. Kyle's sure that an adult is involved, because her daughter could never reach the overhead compartment by herself. Nearby, Sky Marshal Gene Carson observes and starts monitoring Kyle while she searches. Kyle becomes more panicked, runs to the cockpit and starts banging on the pilot's door. Carson restrains her and releases her when she begins to calm down. Captain Marcus Rich finally emerges and meets with Kyle to help assist in the situation. Stephanie tells the captain that she's done a head count and Julia was not among them. Looking over the records, Captain Rich suspiciously asks Kyle if she's had any drinks or is on any medication, to which Kyle replies that she's taken a combination of sleeping and anxiety pills. She's been on these prescriptions for a week since her husband's death. She tells the crew she's taking her husband's body back home. Kyle further reveals that her husband died falling from the roof 6 days ago, which she still refuses to believe was a suicide. The captain and crew suspect Kyle might be affected by her husband's death and imagined bringing her daughter on board. She pleads with the captain to look for the child. Although initially reluctant, the captain feels for Kyle and orders the lights come on for every passenger to be seated and for the flight attendants to check every closet and bin. The captain has every nook and corner of the plane checked. Kyle also goes from seat to seat, looking for Julia. Carson keeps a close watch as she continues her search. Moving through the aisles, Kyle sees an Egyptian man she vaguely recognizes from somewhere. She tries to remember, but her brain is too preoccupied. Everyone at this moment thinks that Kyle is delusional and making up the story of having a child on the plane. Captain Rich is furious when she requests that the cargo holds be checked. Captain Rich states that 425 passengers on the plane are not getting attention since all his staff is looking for her child, the one whom no one ever saw board the plane. He becomes irritated and states if she's still unsatisfied with everything they have done, she can take it up with customer service when they land. Kyle remembers something and runs back to the Egyptian men. She confronts them and states that they were the shadowy figures looking into her daughter's room the previous night. They argue back by saying that they were in the Hilton last night, showing receipts that the hotel was nowhere near her apartment. Kyle forces the man to confess, and Carson, who is fed up with her behavior, explodes. She says that maybe her daughter is being held hostage and their flight is being hijacked. She suspects they picked her because she knows how the plane was built. Carson thinks she's lost it and states that her husband's death makes more sense now after having spent several hours with her, and he's now ready to jump out of the plane. Kyle realizes that the captain has given the order for the seatbelt sign to be turned off, and she runs to the cockpit to see why. He takes her to a corner and tells her that a child has died. The captain mentions he received a wire from the hospital in Berlin, and that her daughter Julia was with her father when he fell off the roof, and she died of internal injuries. Kyle furiously denies this. She is sure Julia is still alive and on the plane. She tries to run back and is stopped by the other passengers. The Egyptian men knocked her down. Now Carson feels that Kyle is a threat by making up such a story, so he handcuffs her and keeps her in her seat. A therapist approaches her and tries to consult her because they believe she's acting out in pain due to the loss of her child. Kyle is almost convinced that she's lost her sanity. She now begins to accept her daughter's death. However, she then notices the heart Julia had drawn earlier on the window. Kyle becomes convinced that something strange is happening. She then convinces the therapist to let her use the bathroom. However, when she gets there, she climbs into the upper compartment and sabotages the aircraft electronics so it deploys the oxygen masks and disrupts the passengers and crew. Everyone starts to panic, but Carson soon realizes that Kyle is behind it. Kyle then uses the chaos to get into the lower frame of the plane. She finds her husband's casket there. She suspects Julia is inside but finds only her husband's body and nothing else. Carson finds Kyle near the casket, puts her in handcuffs and brings her back to her seat. Everybody on the flight claps as a token of appreciation that she is taken into custody. Carson tells Kyle that the flight is making an emergency stop at a Newfoundland airport, where she will be taken into custody. Kyle pleads with Carson to reconsider that something is wrong. Carson considers for a moment and then decides to speak to the captain. However, instead of going to the cockpit, he goes to the flight deck. There, he removes 2 explosives and a detonator concealed in the casket. He climbs down to the avionics section and attaches the explosives to the side of the platform, revealing Julia, who is sleeping there. At this point, it's revealed that Carson's behind all of this. Carson and Stephanie have conspired to hijack the aircraft for a $50 million ransom and frame Kyle for it. Carson tells Captain Rich that Kyle is a hijacker and threatens to blow up the plane unless the airline transfers $50 million into a bank account. Carson then tells Stephanie that he intends to blow up the plane, killing Julia and shooting Kyle. He plans to frame Kyle for hijacking. Once back in his seat, Carson lies to Kyle that the plane will land and the FBI is looking into Julia's case. Kyle still couldn't believe everything that's happened and anxiously looks out the window as the plane begins to land. Other passengers are confused as the plane makes an emergency landing. Passengers and crew start exiting the plane, leaving Carson and Kyle on board. Although Carson wants Kyle to be seated, Kyle runs to the captain before he exits to say that she'll find her child soon. The captain angrily declares that the ransom has been paid and that there is no need to act anymore. Kyle's confused by this and soon realizes that this is all Carson's doing. He used the situation to twist the truth and make it look like Kyle is a terrorist. Recognizing this, Kyle decides to take advantage of a new role as a hijacker, commanding Carson to remain aboard the plane. Carson initially hesitates, but he realizes the others may recognize something's wrong if he refuses. All the flight members leave, with only Carson and Kyle staying behind. Now, before Carson can lock the door and turn around, Kyle uses a fire extinguisher to knock him unconscious and handcuffs him to a rail. She then takes the detonator from his pocket. Stephanie comes out of hiding as Carson regains consciousness and chases after Kyle while shooting at her. Kyle locks herself in the cockpit, while Carson tries to get her out. She opens a hatch door to the plane's upper deck and throws a binder, which makes a loud sound. Carson hears this sound and pursues it. Kyle comes out of the cockpit and encounters Stephanie. There's an altercation where Kyle punches her and Stephanie panics and runs out of the plane. Kyle continues to look for her daughter within the avionics of the plane, and she finds Julia unconscious. They only have a moment to reconnect before Carson soon follows. Carson reveals that he murdered her husband to smuggle the explosives inside his casket, knowing that it would not be scanned at the airport's checkpoint. Kyle takes Julia, hides inside a safe zone, a place impervious to destruction, and uses the detonator. The flame kills Carson immediately as the passengers watch the blast from outside, and then in the final moments Kyle reappears with her daughter in her arms. As Kyle carries her, the crew and passengers are shocked upon realizing that she has been telling the truth the whole time. As the morning breaks, Captain Rich approaches and apologizes for not believing her. This is when Stephanie is handcuffed and taken into custody by the FBI. Kyle carries Julia to the car through the crowd of passengers who have realized the truth and feel embarrassed for not believing her all this while. Drugged Julia wakes up at last and sleepily asks, "Are we there yet?" As they get ready to leave, the Egyptian passenger helps to pick up their bags, a small show of respect. That's our recap of the 2005 movie Flight Plan.